Good evening and welcome to Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Our producers went out onto the streets to hear your views on equality. Watch this insert as we unpack inequality in South Africa tonight.
In paper, it's one thing, but the reality on the ground is very different. The disparity clearly is definitely there, job opportunities. A lot has to be done to bridge the gap.
I think South Africa is actually very far from being equal. Even the economics will actually say that the Gini coefficient, which is a measure between the rich and the poor in South Africa, each and every year it's actually going up.
There's a high unemployment rate at the moment, but there's some demographic who don't even recognize that there's a high unemployment rate.
Don't think that equality is like something that's really that attainable on every single level.
Everyone in this country is given like equal opportunities, to succeed and strive, also to live better. I can say that with the grants offered and stuff like that.
Till now we have to struggle to get into a job sector, or we have to prove ourselves because of the color of our skin.
There is no equality in both different races and genders. Of course, white people still get preferences at jobs or at where they want to live. For example, if you're looking for a place to stay in Royston, and if you sound too black, you may be rejected. But if you sound too white, you may get a place.
In a corporate space, I find that we're still not on par with our male counterparts.
The Bill of Rights guarantees the right to equality in South Africa. Since the advent of democracy 30 years ago, economic inequality, however, has remained stubborn, earning South Africa the position as one of the most unequal countries in the world, according to the 2022 World Bank report on inequality. And tonight, we try to find the answers. Why is South Africa still one of the most unequal countries in the world 30 years after democracy? Joining me for this discussion in studio this evening, Commissioner Tsepo Madlingozi from the Human Rights Commission, as well as former Minister Jay Naidoo and also the founding Secretary General of COSATU. And also joining us over Zoom this evening is Sharon Ikambaram. My apologies, Ikambaram. Sharon is from the social justice cluster, from the social activism cluster, the Movement for Social Justice. And of course, you can be a part of this conversation by sending us your views on #Democracy30, or you can find us at SABC News on X and various other social media platforms. I'm going to start here, and I want to start with you, Mr. Jay Naidoo. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. Really do appreciate it. And we perhaps need to start with the rudimentary and fundamental question around the definition of inequality, because while it may seem very silly, a lot of people have different understandings of what inequality is. So if you take a very crude example of it, inequality is the measurement of the distance between the haves and the have-nots, or we can say the rich and the poor. But from a policy-making perspective, what is the definition of inequality, particularly the one that the Nelson Mandela administration, which you were a minister of, had to work under?
Well, I think that the attempt that we made in formulating what we call the Reconstruction and Development Program, which was actually a very grassroots program where people, students in universities, workers in factories, people in communities, in every sector. In the early 90s, there was a flowering of people's forums, of specific organizations dedicated towards addressing the transformation of South Africa. It was all very good that we all sat under one big tent around a single demand of one person, one vote in a democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa. But particularly from the union movement, we were very keen to understand what would replace apartheid. And that's where the notion of a Reconstruction Pact emerged and eventually became the Reconstruction and Development Program, which identified what were the basic needs of our people, and how that would become the lodestar for determining government policy, their right to quality education, quality health, the opportunity even within factories and farms, that there would be negotiations around how the Reconstruction and Development Program was going to be implemented in those constituencies. There was a lot of talk about industrial policy. And I think
I want to pause you there, Mr. Naidu, because I do want us to come back and ask the question, have we achieved some of those early aspirations of overcoming inequality from a material perspective? But before we go there, Tsepo, you're a lawyer. To lawyers, words matter. They have meaning and they carry weight because they have implications and impact. Yeah. When we talk about inequality, what are we talking about? A crude measurement of the distance between the rich and the poor, or is it a lot more convoluted than that?
No, it's very, very simple. As people in your inset were saying, it is about how people experience their material daily existence. So for us as a Human Rights Commission, we work with the notion of substantive equality. So not just equality on paper or formal equality, but in terms of outcomes. Do we have a society where every child goes to bed with a full stomach, where people access education, where there is shelter, where there is a sense of material belongingness? So the notion of substantive equality talks to outcomes in terms of equality. So for us, that's why Section 9 is so good of the Constitution. It talks about formal equality, but it also talks about measures that are needed to be taken.
Does it guarantee substantive equality?
It does do so. It does do so, especially if it's read with other rights in the Constitution. The right to dignity, the right to life, and a host of socio-economic rights. If they're read together...
I'm guaranteed housing, right?
Yes.
That's shelter is a constitutionally enshrined provision.
That's right.
Can I go sue the government for not having provided me a house in the last 30 years? That's what I mean by guarantee.
That's right. The socio-economic rights in the South African Constitution provides for access to shelter within reasonable, resources, if the state has resources. So what the state needs to demonstrate, and as a Human Rights Commission, we have found that the state is not doing so. Are they working towards progressively ensuring that everyone has a shelter, and everyone has got formal housing? So the Constitution guarantees a progressive access to housing. And what we have found is that in many places, there has been a violation of rights in the sense that policies that are there do not move us towards that progressive realization of human rights.
Sharon, I want to bring you in here. Can the state alone and the Constitution as a tool in its hands guarantee people access to equitable services, access to equitability generally in an attempt at overcoming inequality?
Yes, I think that's good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. I think the part of the pie that we're not talking about is what is the role of the private sector? What's the role of corporates in contributing to transforming the society? We know the history of the mining sector and the excessive exploitation of black labor, the compounds, the conditions that people lived under, and the Constitution, being transformational, gives the government the power to bring the private sector on board to contribute to this transformation. And what we have seen through policies like growth, employment, and redistribution, not three of those have never been met to date. But we found that the company taxes have been reduced progressively over the years. So I think that's the first question. And the second, which does remain a question, is...
Sharon, can I just pause you there and ask this? Are you saying that we've been gearing towards, excuse the pun there, free market fundamentalism where the state just sort of hoped that the private sector would play their part in overcoming inequality?
Yeah, it's the core of neoliberal politics, economics that has, the global market that is resulting in extreme, excessive inequalities and working conditions that many are describing as going back to the industrial era and the kind of conditions that workers worked under with the informal sector and being stripped of all forms of human dignity. But I think the second point I just wanted to raise is that civil society and we as people living in this country, we have to get organized to hold any state to account. Whoever's in government, it's our job in a democracy. In order to have a strong democracy, people have to hold the government to account. And I think that that's where there has been a failing. And there's many reasons for that. But I think that's also a factor in the fact that we remain, as people in your insert pointed out, still the most unequal society on earth.
Yeah. Jainadi, if what Sharon's saying is true, it means that private capital has not been held to the same level of accountability and pressure to carry the duty of overcoming inequality. If that's true, why is that?
Well, we can complain till we blue in our face about state capture that has sucked R1 trillion out of our economy, about the failure of our education system, which is still training people to try and go and look for jobs which are not going to be there because technology is fundamentally changing the nature of the production line. And so I think the question really is what is to be done. None of the critical stakeholders, whether in the public or private sector or state institutions, have played their role in addressing inequality and poverty and joblessness in South Africa. Let's accept that as a given. Now, the question is, surely we can do something. I remember a conversation in the first 5 years where we talked about every black person that owned a state house in a township should get title to their house if they've stayed there a certain number of years. Now, that's the main challenge. If we do not put assets in the hands of people that have been disadvantaged by 370 years of being underdeveloped, undereducated, and kept in a deeply exploitative state, then how are we going to have the ability to raise capital? Yeah. I met a farmer. I'm in the Northwest. I met a farmer. Let me just finish this. I met a farmer. I searched for 3 years to find real black farmers. I met a black farmer, a few weeks ago, because I'm interested in seeing how transformation of land and farming is emerging in South Africa, particularly here in the breadbasket of the Northwest. And I asked him, he had been given 160 hectares of land with water, but he had no title. So he was stuck. He could not raise a single cent. 8 years he's been banging on doors. Yes, he had some occasion to be blacklisted, but no one wants to give him capital. So this is the issue that we have to face. Access to assets, access to land, and then access to capital. Can
I just hold it there, because I do want us to
services which are not there.
Yeah, I don't want us to come back to that, and we're going to look at some numbers that gives real context and texture to the conversation around inequality. But of course, we have to take a break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Democracy 30. I'm in conversation with Commissioner Tsepo Madlingozi from the Human Rights Commission, Mr. Jainadi, former minister in the cabinet of Nelson Mandela, and also the founding general secretary of COSATU, as well as Sharon Ekambaram, who is part of the Movement for Social Justice. Before we go back to the conversation, let's have a look at some of these figures that give us a sense of the inequality journey and picture in South Africa's democracy over the last 30 years. We start with this graph. This graph gives us a view of inequality within population groups within South Africa. Black people, Asian people, colored communities, as well as white people. What you will see here is that over time, the bottom 50% of black people have gotten poorer. But that seems to be a true fact for all racialized groups. But it also shows us that over time, the top 10% of each racial groups have gotten better well off, particularly with a massive surge of wealth accumulation amongst the top 10 within the black population. And the middle class seems to have just carried on while within the middle. That is the median 40% as well as the average. Let's take a look at this particular graph. This graph gives us a sense of income inequality in South Africa over the last 30 years compared to other emerging markets over that same period. You will notice that South Africa, which is the red line that you're seeing on your screen there, has experienced income inequality that has been rising over time, while the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the emerging markets world, have had a reduction in income inequality over time. And that is not just a measurement of income inequality between the bottom class as well as the middle class. It is also income inequality between racial groups, men and women in the workplace. Sharon, when you look at those numbers, you have to ask yourself, why is it that wealth accumulation have become easier for those who have already had it and have become a lot more difficult for those who never had it? That is to say that the bottom quintile of every population group or every demographic group in South Africa have just gotten poorer collectively.
So I think, the starting point is the point that Jay raised around our history. 350 years or so of colonization and apartheid resulted in unfair privilege awarded to people based on the color of their skin. So that legacy continued into our democracy. And it has to take a concerted effort, a plan. And maybe Jay's right, we had the Reconstruction and Development Program, and unfortunately there was no social movement to take that forward and hold the state to account for such a plan if it was indeed in the traditions of the Freedom Charter, because we know how the Freedom Charter came about through struggle. It wasn't given to us on a plate. So I think that's the first part of it. And then, of course, the second part is, as I mentioned earlier, we've come through, firstly, we got to mention the major setback that COVID has resulted in with extreme severe regulations that disproportionately affected poor people, predominantly black people, predominantly black women. And prior to that, you've had privatization, outsourcing, which has seen a bloodbath of jobs being lost, jobs that have never been replaced. So we are sitting with structural unemployment, not just 50% of young people. And so, just one last point. I think an important point to make is tertiary education, struggles by students with fees must fall, has resulted in a spectacular increase in the number of young people from so-called previously disadvantaged communities being able to access tertiary education. But then they come out unemployed.
Can I pause you there, because I do want to maybe stick to that point. Tepo, how unequal is education input in South Africa?
Yeah, I taught at the university, 2 universities for about 15 years. And I was lucky enough to teach both first years, fourth years, and also at the PhD level. What you find is that there's a high attrition rate. So if you have 100 students in the first years, the students who end up graduating is about 20 students. So there's a lot of students who drop out. They drop out because of lack of funding. They drop out because of feeling alienated. They drop out because they cannot access, students with disabilities. They don't have learning materials. So the gap in education, and you will remember that education is a platform.
Is there a pattern?
It's a vehicle for social mobility.
Is there a pattern between who drops out and who doesn't?
Black students, students with disabilities, are the ones who drop off more than any other student. So in the Human Rights Commission Inequality report from 6 years ago, we found that the education sector has not done enough to include and to make black students and students living with disabilities to feel very much welcome. And the struggle for fees must fall, a noble struggle, and those issues still remain today, that there is NEFSAS, and we commend the state for that provision, but there's a lot of mistakes and a lot of administrative hurdles that are there with NEFSAS.
In 30 seconds, it's a very trite answer.
Yeah.
Why is a failure in educational equality a precursor to a failure in economic and social justice equality?
Look, I'm a first-generation student, higher education student in my family. My ability to finish high school, to get a PhD overseas and so forth, has enabled me to pull my family out of poverty. So there's a direct correlation between educational outcomes, health outcomes, and also social mobility. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Let's take a look at this graph around youth unemployment. Again, in the blue, you will see emerging markets. Those are our peers that we measure ourselves against. And in the red column, you will see South Africa. Youth unemployment in emerging markets is hovering just above 10%. In South Africa, it's well above 50 or the 50% mark right now. And if you look at this particular, this final graph around geographic split of inequality, the yellow graph, the yellow bar that you see there is where the South African median around income per capita sits. And you will see that income per capita in Gauteng and the Western Cape is higher than the national median, and every other province thereafter lags behind, with the Eastern Cape and Limpopo lagging the furthest behind. And of course, we then have to come back to this. And Jada, I want to bring you back into here, Mr. Naidu. Why is it that we haven't been able to re-engineer and reconfigure the flow of capital, the flow of equality and opportunity across the geographies of South Africa, that it remains concentrated in the Gauteng province and the Western Cape province?
Well, I think sometimes we should actually take a leaf out of history. In 1948, the National Party came to power on a racist agenda of protecting the rights of a white minority, but they made a specific commitment to deal with the poor white problem. If I look at that, they built state corporations, they built a land bank, they built development finance institutions that extended cheap credit to farmers and businessmen. And if I look at how they achieved, in 30 years, they built themselves into a significant standard of power within the economy. Now, we've been in power for 30 years. I live in the Northwest. I look at this mining development that is here, that is creating an ecological nightmare that is killing people in our communities because of pollution by toxic chemicals and the type of rampant illegal and legal mining encroaching on the rights of our human rights. Now, I look at that and say, in our democracy, that is what we discovered and we actually built as a mining development that could have fundamentally changed the apartheid spatial planning, that could have created a different way. Even though mining is destructive, it could have had greater benefits, social benefit, because mining, you get a license on the basis of your social benefit, and none of that has happened.
Yeah.
So we've had a failure of governance in our country. So we go back to the question that Sharon raised. We are on our own as citizens.
Mr. Naidu,
unless we understand how we can organize ourselves to protect these constitutional rights we talk about it, they will remain on paper for another 30 years. Can
I pause you there? I am going to get in trouble if we don't pay some bills right away. The conversation isn't ending here. We continue on the other side of this. Don't go away. As we wrap up our discussion here on Democracy 30, given the past 30 years, what has been achieved and how can we make sure that we get the trajectory right going forward? Or should things remain the same? Tsepo, I want to start with you. In exactly a minute, we are pressed for time, so in exactly 1 minute, where is it that we're not getting the constitutional progressivism correctly? Have we not amended Section 25 of the Constitution fast enough? Have we not amended certain parts of the Constitution that secures material well-being fast enough? Where are we lagging behind?
Well, firstly is some of our macroeconomic policies that we have adopted. There's no doubt they undercut constitutional promises, this neoliberal austere policies. Number two, a failure of governance. We've got good policies, but there's no monitoring, there's no inspection, and so forth. Number three, we have not done enough in terms of horizontal application of the Constitution, in a sense of holding corporates accountable for redistribution, for transformation. And then lastly, corruption, maladministration takes away money that could be put into socio-economic resources. So those four things, if we do them right, we will see a fundamental change. Of course, active citizenry is also an issue. We need a citizenry that is active, that also holds the state accountable.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Tsepo, thank you so much for your contribution and your inputs. Of course, this is not an exhaustive point of the conversation. The thing about inequality is that there are various facets of inequality, and this is merely but the introduction to that conversation. Here on Democracy 30, over the next couple of weeks and months, we will explore various other aspects of inequality. I do want to thank my guests this evening, Commissioner Tsepo Matlingozi, as well as former Minister Jay Naidu and activist from the Movement for Social Justice, Sharon Ikambaram. My name is Oliver Dick. Dixon. It's good night for now. Cheers.